Good afternoon and good evening. This is Oasis XP. Welcome everybody. My name is Sanje Ratnavel, and I'm joined today by Joel Backon, the Vice President at Oasis. We have a record crowd today, over 340 people registered. So I'm going to start off with a few announcements, and then we will get stuck in. First of all, if you're a member school, you know that our pathways are starting in June again, and Joel has developed with our network a whole series of new pathways in addition to our foundational pathways in competency-based education, project-based learning, and social-emotional learning. There are new ones coming on stream in cultural competency, in grading, critical thinking, and STEAM, amongst other things. If you are planning on arranging an academic meeting with your academic team, May is obviously a key month for us and for you. So please do that. We're happy to talk to you about anything you want to talk about, but in particular, I think the biggest issue really is the one we're tackling today. So set that up as soon as you can, and we can always, of course, help you on some of the other stuff. If you have not taken, if your school has not taken the admissions process 2021 survey, which closed on Friday, we're not looking at it until 10:30 a.m. Pacific tomorrow. I can tell you there's already 125 schools that have taken it. So you can complete it tonight if you have the time. So with that, I am going to, first of all, give you a sense of what we're planning to do today. We sent many of you some homework, and it's amazing how many people clicked on the homework links that we set. So I'm assuming that most of you have actually read the articles that we sent, because the presentation that we're doing is really leverages off that particular set of articles. So what we thought we'd do today is imagine that we were running a school, probably a day school, maybe a day boarding school, and examine the issues regarding what needs to happen in the fall. We've done a lot of work on this over the course of the last week, and what we're trying to do here is not give you a template, obviously, but to give you our opinions. It's always good to have someone else's opinions to criticize, to dismiss, to adopt, to adapt, whatever you like. We are obviously very interested in hearing your opinions on some of the issues. And I think there is a kind of decision process that needs to take place. So we have 200, 300 of you on here today. And so we would really hope that once we finish talking, we could take some of your questions. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes or so. Joel's going to pitch in, and then we'll take some of your questions. Feel free to enter your questions at any time. You can enter them anonymously if you want to. So I'm going to start really with a decision tree that we put together on what schools might have to go through in terms of the decisions before they make a decision on what's going to happen in the fall. Now, obviously, the ideal situation is that we start school at school and there's no online learning, the way in which we've had it in the last couple of months or last month, and everything returns to normal. But I think we have come to the conclusion that that is definitely not going to be possible. So you've heard a lot in the newspapers about the importance of testing from all across the nation. And so we started off by really diving into the testing issue, because I think that is going to make the decision on the kind of fall rollout that is going to be possible. Now, we've learned also that it's not good to take advice from people who don't know too much about testing. So take my research with a grain of salt. I should tell you that what I've done here is I've talked to a pathologist that runs a very large lab here in Los Angeles. I do actually have a background in diagnostic companies. I actually ran one in the mid 1990s. And so there are three basic tests that are out there right now. There's a screening test, which is called an ELISA test. which is an enzyme-linked immunoassay. That's a screening test, and that's the one that most people are using to try and see whether they've got COVID or not. The problem with that test is that it has a huge amount of false negatives, 25 to 30%. And so it really doesn't give very much data. And it's not the kind of test that you will be able to use as a school to be able to decide whether or not your teachers or students have coronavirus or not. The second test, which is what everyone is really putting their minds on, is the PCR test. And polymerase chain reaction test is administered by a complex machine in hospitals usually. The amount of tests that can be administered are tiny. The pathologist that I spoke to said that for his hospital, they can only generate about 40 tests per hour or so. And so the limited amount that they could do in a day means that the priorities going forward is going to be definitely for first responders and people who are essential workers. And so the chances of getting tests for the working community at large is all dependent on Abbott and some of these other major companies bringing on board very, very large testing machines that have not been developed. And so they will not be available, I can pretty much guarantee you, before the September school start, and probably won't be available for some time, which means that the only real reliable test is not going to be available for us as schools, for our students or our teachers, in my opinion. And the final test is the antibody test. And as you know, the antibody test is only of any value once you've actually had the coronavirus, and it's 2 to 3 weeks after you've had it. And even the antibody test has limited value in terms of being able to use it as a screening tool beforehand. So without a test, basically, we are in the same position that the states and the public schools are in. And that is that we're balancing the issues of the economy and our customer bases with life and death. And it looks like some states are starting to go down that route. Most states tend to put opening schools at the bottom of the list, at least the last elements of who will get opened up. But we really don't know what the status is. And you can see from the articles that some nations like Denmark and others have already started opening schools and just taking more precautions. So I think the third issue that comes to mind, of course, is liability. Are you going to be able to open a school when you don't know whether or not your customer base, your students, or your employees have coronavirus? And I think the third thing that comes along with that is, will some teachers be prepared to come back if there is a risk, particularly those who have underlying medical conditions or who are in more vulnerable categories? And will there be teacher attrition as a result of that? And then, of course, will the students, will the parents be okay with taking the kinds of risks that some states and nations are taking? I think all this leads to some of the options that have been put forward in those articles. And I think I want to start by dismissing some of these options. And the first one is the calendar option. There have been some calendar options that talk about delaying the start of the school year. Now, most of these, Boston College, I think, stated that they were thinking of delaying the start of the school year until January. I have no idea how that's possible. It's really not feasible from an independent school perspective, because you still have all your teacher costs for those months from September onwards, and you're basically enlarging your fixed cost base. So I just don't see that as an option at all. I do see the possibility of adding a term, maybe at the end as a summer catch-up term or some kind of J-term type option later on. And so if you dismiss those, you're basically back to this issue that the customer is thinking to themselves, well, look, it looks like I'm either going to be doing online in exactly the same way that I've done it before, or maybe the schools will change the way they've done it, or I'm going to have some time during the fall where we're going to have some kind of blended solution where we're able to go back to school in some fashion. And what does that look like? And I think from the perspective of our customer base, they will know that if they decide not to renew and not to come back to us, they will be just stuck with whatever the option is that's given to them by the public schools. And so we have an opportunity to provide something which is different. And they are going to appreciate if they know that we have in mind an option that is either come back to school in a certain way or do online, or carry on doing online and go backwards and forwards in terms of what happens during the course of this coronavirus that makes you feel comfortable. In many ways, that's a kind of medical insurance type attitude towards utilization, where you're saying, look, I appreciate the fact that I'm paying for the choice of being either in or out of network. And when I'm in network, I'm on campus. When I'm out of network, I'm kind of online. And I can choose when that happens. But in terms of the customer's mindset, I think what we have to think about is they're going to be making their decisions sometime in June or July, whether they really just want to come back to our schools. And although some of them may have made deposits and stuff like that, you know, there will be arguments about whether or not they can afford it or whether or not it's the same thing that they signed up for. And I think most colleges, certainly, you're hearing a lot of colleges saying that they will make a decision in June on on what they will do. So the other issue that comes out of these articles is this idea of reduced class size as a solution and changing the schedule for reduced class size. But with that, obviously there are issues for independent schools, because usually with reduced class sizes, you have to have more teachers. And if you have to have more teachers, obviously that's not something that's easily affordable when your enrollment is potentially suffering. They also talk about having different grades days and having certain grades that come on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and having some kind of rotating schedule. And of course, it'll mean normally that you would have more sections. Now, we think that this is the best approach that independent schools should be looking at, and that is reducing class size, but reducing class size in a way that does not cost them more money. And there is a way to do that. And we have talked about this for many years. In fact, when we were our very first conference in 2013, we had keynotes from the Christensen Institute, Michael Horn and Heather Staker, who are experts in blended learning. And what they suggested is that schools should move towards more of a flex blended model. Now, the flex blended model actually enables there to be much more differentiated teaching, essentially class size reduction. And I'm going to show you some models of how that could work. But if you use the flex blended model and you say to yourself, I think what we're going to do is we're going to continue with this online piece, but we're also going to offer an ability for those parents who feel comfortable sending their students to school, knowing that the coronavirus issues have not been settled, but we are taking incredible precautions in terms of our hygiene and everything else. This is how it could work. And I've separated it here into two elements. One is those classes which are still very content-based and sequence-based and tend to be much more team and teacher-driven. And then those classes that could be made more project and social emotional learning based and would be more student-driven. And if you use the flex blended model for content and sequence, you can still keep your course designations. You can still keep honors, algebra 1, etc. You can reduce the class sizes in this model. You can have breakouts. You can use standards-based grading, and I think that will be an important piece, particularly to dial down the social emotional learning issues that are coming with, worrying about your grades when you're not getting the kind of relational support that you're used to. It has impacts on space. It definitely has impacts on team teaching. And you can use this same blended flex model in the online space. In terms of using the flex blended model for more student-centered approaches, you can use it for project-based learning. And to do that, what you would do essentially is to convert more of your electives into project-based learning electives, which are geared around an essential question, not project-oriented learning, which still keep the content and sequence in place and use the project as some kind of summative endpoint. You could start to do that for a complete elective. You could start to do that for more units. And you could start to do things like portfolio days, which are used a lot in elementary schools. So my recommendation, just reading through all those articles and thinking about where schools could go to provide a hybrid kind of high flex, I think was the model that someone referred to in the higher ed version, would be to go down this flex blended model. The flex blended model is in use in K-12 all over. And here I'm going to give you a few examples. And these are taken from the Innersight Institute. The Christensen Institute became the Innersight Institute in 2012. And you can see that this is a station rotation model, which is where you've got teacher-led instruction, you've got collaborative activities, and then you've got the online instructional component. And so the online instructional component can still be kept. This is very much a typical elementary school model that this blending paradigm came out of. But then it was expanded. And it was expanded to try and scale it to a much larger context. And here is an example in the San Francisco Flex Academy in Santa Clara. I actually visited this school in 2013. And here what you see is that essentially what you've done is you've created the online learning piece as a central piece that's driving students in various different sections. You can see that the students are essentially in different sections, but teachers are collaborating to provide dynamic instruction when needed, and using the breakout rooms, using the collaboration rooms, and even using labs or project-oriented facilities when they're doing work that's more project-oriented. So this is a very good example of how a flex model could work. And if you put it into an academic context, and you wanted to, let's say, look at it from a 7th grade math sequence, you would have the pre-algebra, algebra 1, algebra honors, math 7 in those kind of smaller sections. And so the teachers would be driving instructions, and you'd be able to still keep those designations. But if you felt like one particular student was moving ahead and needed to be promoted to one section, you still have that flexibility. A lot of schools do that. They do that with AP and honors designations, where they keep the AP and honors designation open until a certain milestone. And so this provides that flexibility to do that. And what you then have is really a math team that is a bigger math team that has those skills to be able to teach all those different elements. And they're doing breakouts in as they need it. And of course, you can do that for something like a reading sequence too, above grade level reading, intermediate, at grade level, or below grade level type situations. You could make the flex spaces also online. So let's take the scenario that if some of your parents say, look, we like this idea of having either online or blended, right? But we're probably going to be mostly online until there's real visibility on whether or not the curve has been completely taken down and where there are virtually no cases in our area. So you could make that flex spaces also work in an online context where you have a kind of cyber lounge where you've got breakouts taking place in a cyber lounge of a number of teachers teaching, doing breakouts at certain times. And the teachers are also, of course, do Zoom teaching or whatever, synchronous or asynchronous classes at certain times. And the great thing about this flex model is that it dovetails with things like standards-based grading, because what you're really doing is you're using the standards to decide how fast and how much intervention is really needed. It dials down the pressure, but what it does do is it places a much greater much greater emphasis on formative assessment. So those schools, and there are schools, independent schools that have done this, and here you're looking at Nick Dresler, who's an English department chair, one of our network leaders, who's essentially done this. And you can see all the arrows of all the different students, whether they've met particular standards, expectations in those various different grade level standards. What you have to do is you have to create a much bigger formative assessment base, either in the summer, or make sure that for the units that you're targeting ahead to a month ahead or 2 months ahead, you build those formative assessment units. And here's an example from Northfield Mount Hermon, which use the flex model for math. And what they did is they took all the algebra students and they put them all in one large room. They team taught, but they used the data. So every time a formative assessment was generated, it would produce data. And that data would be analyzed by the teaching team. They'd be able to say to themselves every morning, who do we need to take out? And what are the clusters that we're going to break out? And you can see this orange map here, which is basically giving them an idea of who needs help at a particular time. So this isn't just a public school model. This is very much a established pedagogical model that could be used. And then I think you guys are all familiar with our emphasis on project-based learning. We really believe that particularly at a time like this where students really need to have more control over their learning, to be able to give them pathways in a portfolio-driven assessment of projects is ideal. So on the right-hand side here, you see a pathway in environmental advocacy, and you could use this for either an elective or a co-curricular pathway or student learning or something like that. You start by deciding on the outcomes, the competencies or standards and outcomes that you really want the students to use for the project. You look at a set of requirements that they could use to show evidence of a project. You establish yardsticks, you establish grading systems, badges, etc., and then you use a portfolio. The portfolio is not just like a Dropbox. It's something that harbors all the outcomes as well as all the projects and interfaces with the teacher. So to have a project-based learning pathway that goes alongside a flex modeling paradigm, I think would be a great way for students to progress during this extraordinary time. To do this, if you are going to go back to school, I think what you're going to need to do is you're going to have to repurpose some larger spaces, and particularly repurpose larger spaces because if you're going to have to establish some kind of social distancing, yardsticks or requirements, that would be necessary. Gyms, there are libraries with lots of breakout rooms, black box theaters, spelt wrong, rooms with, that you might actually break down just like Northfield Mount Hermon did, and common rooms. And then what I would say is that from my perspective, a fall start scenario should look at how this would dovetail with a medium-term plan to change the way school is delivered. And for those of you who have not read it already, we do provide a plan in the COVID survey report that we just did. And our two biggest takeaways there was more project-based learning, and again, using the flex blending and standards-based grading to transition to less but more essential content. We didn't think of it as a maintaining or reducing class size selling point, but clearly it has that major benefit. So keeping an eye on where this will go once the coronavirus is all dealt with, I think is an important piece. And finally, my final thoughts on this, I've been talking for 25 minutes, so I will get some thoughts from Joel and then we'll take some of your questions, is I think the timing is really important. Every time we've done one of these Sunday sessions, the question that always comes up is, what will be the sales pitch to the community? And I think our parents, your parents, independent school parents, parents in general are waiting to find out how they are going to deal with their kids next year. And for them to know that you are thinking about smaller class sizes, which is very much in keeping with obviously the independent school mentality of close relationships, and perhaps even reducing class sizes under this model, which doesn't cost anymore, is a great way to go. I think that to be able to say to them, we are not sure yet what the exact timing is, might be of a blended rollout like this, but it seems very likely that at some point it's going to take place. It might be right at the beginning of the year. It might be the end of September. We have very little evidence that testing will be able to provide us with a clear path towards having everyone back as normal. But we have been making strides towards making these changes. I think will give them a great sense of comfort. So with that, I am going to stop sharing and hand it over to Joel, who's going to comment a little bit on this. Joel, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I think to sum up, the important thing here is that is this whole notion of uncertainty. And with that uncertainty, there are a series of logistical and programmatic changes that we've recommended, and you can probably think of others. But whatever you come up with in those two areas, they are going to require a significant investment of time, planning, design, in order to make them work. And if you're going to make that kind of investment, granted that right now it is tailored for this uncertain environment, then you would want something that is sustainable over the long term. In other words, you don't want to invest tremendous amounts of time and effort in planning for something that could be 6 months, it could be a year, it could be 2 years, nobody knows, but it's not going to be forever. And then something else may happen 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road. So I think what we're suggesting is to think with more of a midterm or longer term view here, in terms of, particularly in terms of the curricular programmatic side of things. The logistical side of things may be more tailored for the current environment, but certainly on the programmatic side, I would think about what is it that we can do to improve the quality of learning in our school. It doesn't matter that it was prompted by this crisis or whatever prompted your thinking, and try to take that to its logical conclusion, rather than saying, what is it that we can do to solve this immediate problem, and then we'll worry about the longer term when this is over, because I think that's a slippery slope, and I think that's when you're going to end up down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, great. Jason, I'm going to take your question first, but we have a question from an attendee. I'm just going to respond to that first, Jason, so just be ready. Do you foresee a return to school scenario in which immunes and susceptibles are the grouping characteristics? In other words, are those that are on campus the immunes, and those that are off campus are the susceptibles? No, I really do not think that's what's going to happen. And I think part of the reason for that is that the antibody tests are way off. The antibody tests also have no value for the first 3 weeks, because they give false negatives. I don't see it breaking down to that situation, unless you've got to a point where there's kind of what's called herd immunity, and that's going to be a long way off. I mean, we have to find a way to serve both our customers who are afraid and our customers who are well and not afraid. And so I think that's the most important piece here. It's absolutely clear in my mind that we will have no way to test with certainty by the time school opens whether or not our students have coronavirus or have had coronavirus even. And even, so in that context, it's very difficult to do anything else other than give them a lot of options. Let me just take a question now from, yes?
We have a request from one of our participants for you to stop sharing your screen so they can see the panelists in full view.
Okay. Stop share. There we go. Um, Roxanne, I'll come to you in a second. Give me 1 second. And let's just take a question from Jason. Jason, you're unmuted, I think, right? Jason, are you there? Jason, are you there?
I don't think I asked the question, though, so I was sort of just listening for now.
Got it, got it. Okay, fine. We have some other questions. Roxanne, I would like to hear if independent schools are looking at different tuition models for families who opt for fully online, the high flex, or 100% in person. Roxanne, I have not heard anyone doing that. I feel like, to be honest, that's going to be an incredibly dangerous thing to do because it's going to open it up for huge amounts of negotiation. The online model is priced at so much less than the non-online model. You know, most of the asynchronous models are around $10,000, and so I would strongly recommend that you don't do that. I can tell you that there's one school here in Los Angeles that for years offered a blended model where they offered a tuition that was 60% on campus and 40% online. They only did that because they had huge demand that they couldn't meet. But I haven't heard of anyone doing that, and I would strongly, strongly recommend against that. Are you there, Roxanne? Would you like to say anything?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, that was just a curious question because I think the number one email that I get right now is all about, are you doing anything different to reduce tuition during this online model? And so moving forward with this plan in the fall that will provide families with options, I anticipate that question growing just because of the perceived value.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, people are prepared to pay for choice. And to be able to say, independent schools are the only people who offer you the choice of either being online or coming back. Whereas if you go to a public school, you're not going to have a choice, unlikely, right? And we can reduce class size because we're going to this kind of flex model, and you're still going to get the community and everything else. And you weren't on this call last week, but there's going to be a lot of public schools who have to reduce their expenses too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there may be a way to negotiate and use this flex model to kind of address the people who don't have very much money, and you can say, you know, make that argument, but I would definitely not entertain a fully online option.
Got it. Thank you.
Jim Pickett. The governors and others have suggested cohort models or groups of students in groups of 25 to 30 that never interact with others in other cohorts in a flex but blended model sometime on campus. How do you imagine the process working? Jim, I'm going to have to ask you to explain what you mean by that. Here we go. Jim, are you there? Jim?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So, yeah, that was a complicated question, wasn't it? So let's say, for example, because I've heard this from other states as well, that the state or the local governments would say, you can reopen your schools, your class size will be 25 or 30. Those students must stay together all day long. They can't interact with anyone else in their grade level. I suspect this is going to happen in some places, and I you know, thinking out loud as you're, you know, thinking about this flex blended model, it seems like that could potentially work, but you wouldn't be able to, for example, have kids crossing cohorts to go into any sort of mixed session where, you know, my best friend who happens to be in the other cohort of, you know, 25 or 30 classmates could actually interact with me.
Yeah, but Jim, I mean, I think a lot of these governors have no idea.
I would agree.
how these tests work, honestly. go find a pathologist or some medical person who really understands. And what they will tell you is if you take that 25 to 30 kids and you tested all of them using one of those three tests, the ELISA test, the PCR test, or the antibody test, right? You will have very little certainty whether they have the coronavirus or had the coronavirus. So you're just putting 25 to 30 people together that you have no real visibility on whether they're, they're safe. And even the writer of the article, I think was when he was talking about those grade levels at certain points, which are kind of segregated or like an apartheid system of some kind. The testing doesn't substantiate that kind of segregation.
I wouldn't disagree with you, by the way. I'm just curious about that because I'm hoping that we don't come to that stage, but I fear that we may in some way, shape, or form.
It may come from a kind of parent lack of knowledge too that you might have to address. Are you back in LA yet?
Nope, I'm still up in the Bay Area.
Okay. Next question, Laura. What are your thoughts about the transition options for boarding schools specifically? I was wondering about. Let me just unmute you. Hi, Laura. Really, this is addressed more to boarding day and day. I think for most of the boarding schools, they're just going to have to find some way to, for the people coming from abroad, to quarantine them for some time. I don't know whether that's going to happen, but again, it goes back to the testing issue, right? Those tests are not going to provide clarity for you whether they are absolutely free of coronavirus. So the people who come back will have no difference in knowledge relative to where they are, unless the place that they're coming from has eliminated coronavirus, which I think is pretty unlikely.
Thank you. Yes, it's a tough question.
Yeah. Okay. Then we have Robert. How do you foresee the flex blended model for visual art, performing art classes, or electives like engineering, robotics, etc.? Do you see it working differently than math or English or history classes? That's a great question. Where's Robert? Hold on. Robert, are you there, Robert? Robert, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the co-curriculars are perfect for, I'm talking about robotics and things like that, for this, because you can use the project-based learning model, except instead of breakouts, what you're doing is tutoring, right? Tutoring breakouts, where it's, one or two people who are working on a project together. And for the visual arts, etc., I mean, I think most of the time, the visual arts, performing arts is a difficult one. I have no real answers to that. I can certainly try and find out what most of these flex models are doing on the performing arts, but I suspect there's no real flex. It's designed for highly sequenced courses, particularly, but I don't see why it can't apply well to the co-curricular one. Did you have any thoughts?
No, I think I just kind of put the question out there in case you hear of things or find models that people are using or that might work. It'd be interesting to, share them on your website or something, just so those of us who are thinking about it maybe have some resources to go to.
Yeah, it's on the list. I definitely have that down. Robert, which school are you from?
Westminster School in Atlanta, Georgia, and we have a very rich performing and visual art program and an engineering robotics program, particularly in our high school. And we have a middle school innovation lab, and I think we're finding now that place like our innovation lab in our middle school just is not much of a resource right now to teachers in our virtual space, but we'd have to probably really think about redesigning some things to make it more readily available in a more flex blended learning program, let's say next fall, if we had to do that.
Well, I mean, if you had a project period, right, where they had more control over what they were working on, And if there was a way for them to team up with people, and you were able to marshal the use of all those different labs and makerspaces and everything as appropriate, in the same way that the teachers who are essentially controlling the flex model are doing, then I think, you know, it would be a much more fluid schedule, which is what students really want, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, okay.
Thank you.
Then we have, to what degree are families paying for childcare? In other words, this is anonymous. Is independent schooling scheduling resulting in a situation in which schools are creating hybrid scheduling in which students are being kept busy from 8 to 3? I think there is a lot of that. I think there is a lot of that. Not sure what else to say to that. Sean, what thoughts do you have about staffing and PPE in the nurse's office or health center, whether boarding or day? I'm going to recognize you, Sean. You there? Sean? Sean
Yes.
Durrant?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah, tell me what you're thinking here.
Just the complications of right now with staffing health centers, with finding more nurses, with finding personal protective equipment, and to what extent we can have a fully staffed and equipped health center in the fall.
I think not only health, but social emotional learning is going to become the responsibility of everybody, starting with the head of school, you know, with the, and just as the head of school is opening doors in the parking lot or carpool line, you know, we're all going to be doing things to make sure at school that everything is hygienic, etc. So I think, and that same applies to social emotional learning, your question really, because for many schools, social emotional learning tends to be the responsibility of the counseling office, or kind of disappears after elementary school, and maybe is a little bit there in middle school. Both those pieces, I think, will need to be immersed down through schools.
Meaning possibly more
training,
and awareness for teachers.
More training and awareness for teachers. You can't do social emotional learning if you haven't been trained as a teacher to manage your own emotions and all the things that go around that. And that's pretty much more than conventional wisdom. That's kind of a fundamental piece. And there's a lot of that missing in schools today.
Thanks.
John Herzenberg, let me get you, John, hold on. John from Japan. John, go ahead. John, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, my question is about what I'm seeing in my institution is a need for change and response, but also confronting existing cultural constraints in the institution, both from a parent consumer perspective, as well as a faculty kind of nimbleness. So of course the crisis reveals an institution and a community's strengths and weaknesses. And so calibrating change that's best for students is, it's not a time for recklessness, of course, but when you want to advance your institution's pedagogy and program and system of support, so calibrating what's right and what's best for kids, but also not fracturing the institution and the community, both from a faculty and a parent consumer base, is kind of a dilemma that I see myself in.
Yeah, and your question is your question.
Just it's a support call. So I'm getting my SEL in right now. So thank you all for listening. But the question becomes like, how are other leaders, and what advice do folks have around finding that middle path to advance, to respond, but also advance in institutions that are maybe not quite far ahead down the path as some of the other folks on the OASIS kind of team are.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. I think, just from what I'm seeing, I'd love to hear other people's views on John's questions. Please respond and put your hand up. Love to recognize you. I think there are some schools that have basically said to themselves, you know what, we're absolutely not going to change anything. And we're hoping that we start exactly as it is in the past. But I'd love to hear other people's views on what John said. Let me just go to Maritoni. How will you manage, address, and plan co-curricular programs like clubs, academic teams, and student programs like peer group mentorship programs in this flex model? Maritoni. I think the some of the Maritoni, you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. You can't do everything with the flex model. I think the flex model, it works particularly for the content sequence piece, and it definitely can work in a smaller way for the kind of tutoring based, project-based learning or social emotional learning piece. If you can provide pathways that integrate the program across various different pieces, and if you've got a competency-based umbrella that allows you to do that, then the flex model should work fine in that. Are you following me?
Yeah, I am following you. So, Sanjay, this is Candy. You've got my real name.
How are you?
I was going to jump in about social and emotional learning. We're at PDS at Princeton Day School, and that is my mantra as director of wellness, right? So we do have those pathways in, and we do have we actually do have programmatic elements in all three divisions for SEL, but one of the integral parts of that is that interpersonal communication amongst peer-to-peer, mentor-to-peer, and that is where what keeps me up at night. We can do so many things remotely, but just being together is very hard to replicate. Whether or not we can set aside even a little bit of time, we can stagger time, we can put everybody in squares of 6 feet by 6 feet. And so when we talk about independent schools, it is way more, and we've talked about this together many times, it's way more than reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's all those other elements that are integral to who we are and to our culture and our community. We need to think about how we're going to provide that or offer that or support that, because we're not a public school, and we will never want to be a public school, and we can't only think about those silos that are academics. And of course, all of those things resonate and sound in theory like, plans to look forward to and for administration to try, but we also have to think that there's other aspects that also need to be addressed as well when we're thinking about reopening our school, because it's way more than just that. That's my 2 cents.
No, I 100% agree with you. I mean, I don't know whether you read the report that we just put out, the COVID report, but point number 10 is infuse SEL and wellness, through the whole program. The students and over the next year, and even now, are in a not a good place in terms of, and so, as important as anything else is how they are feeling and how they're coping with how they're feeling. And so all those SEL strategies that, we talked about in October and et cetera, and more need to come into play here. 100%. I think you guys at PDS do such a great job with this, and even the projects that are SEL based, like the ones that Tara has done and talked about a lot, enable a lot of those things to come out.
Yeah, just something to think about.
Yeah. Here's another question, anonymous attendee. You suggested getting out ahead of suggesting a hybrid approach and indicating to parents that remote learning will be a reality next year, but many parents hold out hope that September will be normal, and civil authorities in many jurisdictions echo that hope, which doesn't help. Given that most parents will not acknowledge the reality until they are told to do so, which will be late in the game, do we run the risk of sounding alarmist and losing parents and students by suggesting a hybrid in the coming weeks. Personally, I don't think so, because I feel like most people have a sense that even though it may not, even if they are holding on to that vain hope, they know that it's a distinct possibility that it might come back again. And so you could pitch it as something that you're working on for when it comes back. And if you can deploy it earlier, then do it immediately, right? As a result. But you're right, that no one's really focused on this testing thing properly. And people have this wild hope that suddenly we're going to be able to test ourselves back into a return to the past, and we're definitely not. So I totally get what you're saying. Another question, how do you see here schools rethinking summer? In other words, how might summer become a new quarter for student learning and faculty professional learning? Over to you, Joel, for that one.
I think it's a great question, and I think that the summer needs to play a different role than it has played in the past. In the past, I think we've seen summer as time for a break and a rest, and that's important. And maybe long-term, we have to look at how the annual calendar works at our schools, because maybe we've been tied to this agrarian model of having summers off for too long. And particularly with what we know now about summer slide, maybe it's not the best way to approach a school calendar. But for the time being, in the middle of where we are right now, the summer is an absolutely perfect opportunity for faculty professional development and for students to be able to, quote, catch up if they did not have the kind of experience that they might have expected this spring. So this combination of online courses, which is something that OASIS is going to be offering, the OASIS Course Exchange, is one thing to look at. Another are the professional development pathways that Sanje mentioned at the start of this session. I think it's important for faculty to have the tools to be able to really think about what their options are and what possibilities there are to modify how they are supporting student learning in a way that will provide them with more flexibility, given that we do have so much uncertainty about the fall and probably for some period of time going forward.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we did a webinar on summer options. And one of the things that I am absolutely convinced of is that summer represents a brand new opportunity for independent schools. And it is a function of the expected decline in public school services over the next 12 months, 24 months, etc. And with that will come a real need for dual enrollment opportunities at public schools, tutoring opportunities, and all kinds of other extra courses that could be delivered either in person or online at your campuses or online. And most independent schools offer no online summer courses, but they do. So I think that's going to be a significant opportunity going forward for schools. Nat, are you there? Nat Kaufman. Nat, you had a question about faculty and online. Nat, are you there? Nat? How do faculty best build?
Yes, I'm here, sorry.
How are you, Nat?
I'm good, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Yeah, so I really appreciate everything you've done. And the biggest question that my teachers are worried about looking at a hybrid flex thing where they have a whole bunch of new students that, I mean, the great strength of our school this year has been that all of our SEL work had paid off and built in before we got to this. So our teachers and students had really strong relationships. But from year to year, we have a lot of teachers who just teach one grade and don't know that next grade as well. And we're trying to figure out ways to build that trust and build that SEL, looking ahead to the fall when they don't know those kids. And we normally do a camping trip to start the year and all those sort of things that we won't be able to do. Yeah. And how, do any of your modules Or do you have any ideas on how to?
Yeah. I think, the flex model is a cross-grade level model, right? Because particularly for tracking, it's flexible tracking, and flexible tracking generally tends to cross grades. So in that sense, there's an opportunity for those teachers to be able to tell the other teachers who don't know those students, well, this is something that Johnny had a problem with a lot. He wasn't able to factor or whatever it is. So I think the flex model is good in that sense. Other than that,
I guess I'm worried if we're, yeah, we are looking at the flex model, but if we're not literally not able to start the year in the flex model, if the governor still has schools closed,
yeah.
If he's outlined a plan where there has to be 14 straight days with fewer new cases than the day before, and a couple of other things that look difficult to meet.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're presumably doing placement exams, although about 30% of the schools have just have got rid of placement exams. There is a way for you to offer some summer courses online, right? If you wanted to, as a kind of entree to some of these students, that would be one way of doing it in advance. No, I don't have any other good options for a fully online kind of entree. Talk to Stanford Online High School and schools like that and how they do it. Which grade are you talking about? Ninth grade, is it?
Well, all of our grades where there's a big transition in terms of, we have a 5th and 6th grade team, so 6th to 7th, and then 8th to 9th, and then kind of 10th to 11th are where sort of new groups of faculty encounter kids.
Right. Yeah.
But definitely, we have a good part. We're in the Malone partnership with Stanford, so I'll talk to Rick there, and that's a really good idea.
Yeah, I mean, what? I can't remember his name now. The head of school. Who's the head of? He's been there for a long time. Okay.
I know who you're talking about, but I can't remember his name either.
Okie dokes. Nice to talk to you, Nat. Are schools running clubs online? What about athletics? Is any school doing more than just academics right now? What are the possibilities? I have not heard of any school doing any athletics. I've heard of schools planning to delay athletics to January, just like the NFL and others, I think. But there are lots of people who are doing kind of PE courses and yoga courses and stuff like that online, I believe. I haven't heard anything else. Anonymous attendee, I'm fascinated by this conversation. I'm from a school that is currently traditional, but was beginning the process of transforming to experiential learning. What can we do between now and September to get on the right track, given our, great question. Pity that you made yourself anonymous. What can we do to get on the right track? I think personally, but if you're a member school of ours, you obviously know that you should be doing the pathways in project-based learning, competency-based education, and social emotional learning. But I think the most important thing that a school that wants to take it a little bit slowly should do is get together and say, we need to properly make our portrait of a graduate and profile of a learner meaningful, so that it's not just something that sits in a drawer on a website. And it's something that we know that we are going to be targeting for real outcomes. We are going to examine what we think are the important 21st century skills. We're going to examine how our portrait can be made into a realistic competencies that are accessible, and more, and start that process. Because once you have the competency framework, then you can do project-based learning really, not easily, but you can do project-based learning, you can do social emotional learning, and you can transition your grading system to a much better model. So I think that process, sometimes it takes a year, sometimes it takes 3 years. It could be done in a summer if you really wanted to do it, but that would be my advice. How do we effectively deliver both a flex, hybrid, and fully online model simultaneously at a high quality level with current staffing? Our faculty has no distance learning training or experience. what PD should be focused on to be prepared to do this well. The flex hybrid model is partly online, and it's difficult to answer that question without knowing what grade levels you're doing. But the flex hybrid model is essentially doing differentiated learning. Depends on what kind of flex you're thinking you're doing. If you're just keeping the sequence of the content, then you're essentially making sure that you can do some online courses. There are lots of people who provide online course resources, and the rest of it is really just making sure that the way in which the support systems function. For the flex model, you need good data. So you need huge formative assessment banks, and you need teamwork. So you need prep time for the teachers. Every day they're looking at the data to see who's done what, et cetera, and then they decide how they're going to dynamically offer instruction to this group or that group. Anonymous attendee, what is realistic in terms of on-campus and off-campus time for the fall? What do you see as prioritized face-to-face versus sync? I'm not sure I understand that question. Jennifer, would you mind sending out your flowchart slides to webinar participants? Jennifer, they're always available to member schools in our XP portal. Jason, similar question, how will schools prepare new faculty to make the transition to this remote model, and how do help them build cut with students' families from afar? I think again, that's when you say the remote model, if you're talking about the flex model, we have lots of resources in our libraries, etc., that you can use. Anonymous attendee, we're running out of time. What would you pay for independent school tuition in the fall 2020 in California and Texas, in Southeast US, in Boston? Well, that ranges. That obviously ranges by area. Paula, let me unmute you. Paula, are you there? You had a question, Paula Clark? What are the recommendations for early childhood models given the need for childcare and level of parent involvement in distance learning? How does flex work? Paula, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hello.
Are you talking pre-K?
Yes.
Well, I think the flex model and the rotation model, the flex model is an outgrowth of the rotation model, and the rotation model is used in kindergarten a lot, right? I don't know about pre-K, but I imagine it is too, right? Isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I was also thinking about along the lines of if we are not able to go back, what are some ideas there? Because the main concern is we cannot make up for the childcare component, somebody taking care of their children via distance learning.
Yeah, I don't have any more recommendations other than those, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, listen, we've run over a little bit. I appreciate you guys staying on. This is the last of our Sundays with Sunday sessions. If you guys are not a member school, we encourage you to join. We spend most of May setting people up for the summer and for the next year. So please do that as soon as possible. Good to talk to you. And you can always be on our webinars, which also take place in May. And with that, thanks, Joel. Thanks for everyone who participated. And please contact us if you need anything else. Take care.